Hi, I'm Greg, welcome to Affect Studio, and welcome to the first part of my adventure converting this Silverface 1976 100-watt Fender to mid-60s Blackface Fender specs. Rather than alter this in one go like a sensible person, I modified this in stages, recording before and after clips along the way, so you could hear what, if anything, the different sections contribute to the tone. Very inefficient way to do it, but quite enlightening, which was the plan. This amp started life as a Vibrasonic with a 15-inch JBL, but was converted to a twin at some point prior to 1990 when the previous owner bought it. The actual amp is exactly the same for both models. In fact, you'll notice the same schematic is used for the Vibrasonic, Super 6, Quad Reverb, Dual Showman and Twin Reverb. The only change to the electronics was the impedance of the output transformer to match the speakers. A twin has a 4-ohm output to go with a pair of 8-ohm speakers, where the Vibrasonic has an 8-ohm output for the single 15. This has a pair of 16-ohm Celestion G1265, which in parallel gives the correct 8 ohms. There is plenty of information about black-facing Silverface Fenders, and even more opinions on what those changes contribute to the sound. What I couldn't find is good before and after clips to back up these assertions. Now, I should of course point out that while these circuits are relatively simple, we are dealing with extremely high voltages. Even when the amps are off and unplugged, they store voltages that can kill you. These mods should only be done by someone who knows what they're doing. I had planned to present this in stages, but the truth is, most of the changes were too subtle to be heard via YouTube. For anyone who has no idea what I'm talking about, Blackface and Silverface refer to the faceplates on Fender amps, which were used at different periods and roughly correspond with changes to the circuits and quality of the components used in the amps. The general theory is Blackface, which were the last of Leo Fender's designs, although most of them were actually produced after CBS bought the company, are good. Silverface, which were introduced a few years after CBS bought Fender and used roughly the same circuits with various modifications and slightly lower quality components, are less good. Late Silverface, which means from 1977 to early 80s, are even less good. That's a very rough description, as the circuits in some Silverface amps didn't change at all. The only change was the brands and capacitors. With the larger amps, along with the cheaper components, the main criticism is they made them cleaner and louder, losing some of the character and richness of tone the earlier versions are known for. I bought this amp recently. The seller, wanting to make sure everything was working correctly before selling, had spent quite a lot of money having it serviced. One of the many criticisms with the Silverface amps was that CBS engineers changed the bias circuit. The bias is like the idle in an engine, keeps it running at optimum levels. The service report mentioned the bias as being correct, so I had planned to modify that later after I'd removed the master volume circuit and there was more space to get to it. I installed a new set of output tubes as it had sets from different manufacturers in it and checked the bias. The current was about a quarter of what it should be. I put the old tubes back in thinking they would be right, and it read even lower again. So I decided I should start with the bias circuit. I recorded some rough DI'd guitar parts which I'm reamping, so we're hearing the same performance each time, and obviously set the amp controls so I could easily return them to the same positions. The tone controls are all on 5 and the master is on 10. For the cleaner clip, the volume is on 3 and it's on 10 for the very distorted clip. I have the cabs set up and mic'd in the main room of the studio so I can make changes to the amp and the setup won't be touched until I finish these mods. So the only change we'll hear is whatever has been done to the amp. So here is the bias circuit as it was, reading way too low and then the correct bias voltage. I was surprised at how little difference that made. It sounds slightly louder operating at the correct voltage, and presumably the amp is happier, but there wasn't much change in tone or response. It is slightly tighter and more defined, but it's fairly subtle. The original Blackface circuit has a pot to adjust the bias voltage, making it quite simple to set. Most amps, like this one, are push-pull designs, meaning that one side of the power amp generates a positive signal, while the other produces a negative signal. One side moves the speaker forward, the other moves it backwards, similar to pistons in a car. Like an engine, you want the two halves to be evenly matched for maximum efficiency. This is why we pay extra for matched output valves. As part of cost cutting, CBS engineers changed the bias circuit to a bias balance circuit so they could use cheaper tubes and get them roughly balanced. One side is fixed, and the pot lets you adjust the other side to match the first. The idea gets criticised, but it actually makes sense. It does mean you then need to change the fixed resistor in the circuit to get the overall voltage right, but that's what had been done prior to the Blackface models anyway. It just means that a lot of those amps aren't running at optimum efficiency, as people don't go to the trouble of changing the resistor values to go with a new set of tubes. Although, as we've just heard, it may be less critical than you'd think. Fenders are very forgiving with mismatches. The upgrade I plan to start with for safety is swapping the electrolytic capacitors in the power supply. 2 were generic, and the other 3 appeared to be original, making them 48 years old. The service report from before I bought it said the electrolytic caps were within spec. I've always been told you should replace them every 10 to 20 years for safety, as they can fail without warning and damage other way more expensive components like the transformers. I don't want to risk major damage by not replacing them. Years ago, when I was first building amps, I kept reading that filter caps should be replaced to avoid damage, and realised my AC30 was well over 20 years old and still had the original filter supply caps. I ordered a new set. The day they arrived, before I installed them, I went to a rehearsal, turned on the amp, and smoke poured out. A number of components burned out, fortunately nothing too expensive, and I had all the parts to fix it. So I wouldn't consider not changing these. My question was, do they change the sound at all other than keeping the power supply clean and stable? There are varying opinions, and those opinions are usually polar opposites. The mod section in the tube amp book claims that amps always sound better after the filter caps are replaced. Others say they either work or they don't. I'm not going to play the before and after clips, as the difference was way too subtle to be heard on YouTube. They needed to be changed for the health of the amp, but it was performing correctly as it was. I left it running with a pair of old output tubes so the new ones wouldn't change, with Leo Kottke's 6 and 12 string guitars playing through it on repeat, in case there was any change after they had some hours on them. After 45 hours, the only obvious change was the insides of the 100 watt 15 ohm resistor I was using as a dummy load expanding from the heat, which happened in the first hour. Amazingly, it still reads 15 ohms, even with the 2 output tubes. I turned the volume down after that. The next section I changed was the phase inverter. CBS increased the voltages, giving it more headroom while making it more linear. Having already modified the bias circuit, there are only 5 resistors to change. I was surprised at how little the tone changed here too. I like it better, but the phase inverter circuit is supposed to be the biggest difference between the Black and Silverface circuits. Next, I changed the dropping resistors in the power supply. The CBS engineers increased the values here, which actually lowers the headroom in the preamp. This seems surprising considering they increased the voltages and therefore headroom in the phase inverter. As with the bias balance control, I wonder if this was so they could use cheaper preamp tubes by not putting as much strain on them. This is before and after changing the phase inverter and dropping resistors. The next modification is removing the master volume and boost circuit. Up to this point, I've been swapping resistors with different values, but not modifying the circuit layout at all. This is the first change to the circuit, although it's still quite a simple change. Before we do that, we should have a listen to the boost circuit. The boost circuit also seems at odds with their attempts to make the amps cleaner. To achieve it, they took a tap from the output of the small amp which drives the reverb tank and added that into the main signal. Check out the oscillation in the full volume clip. Not a happy amp. With the amp on 3, it didn't sound terrible, although the master was on 10. It sounded worse with the master lower, but I forgot to record it like that. I've only ever heard disparaging comments about the circuit. I'd be curious to know if anybody did or does use it. Last up is the master volume. The amp looks much cleaner and neater without the extra cables, but more importantly, sounds completely different now. Finally, a significant change in tone. So after all those modifications to the circuit, removing the master made the most difference. I think the new 0.001 microfarad coupling capacitor after the mixing resistors before the phase inverter accounts for most of that. The amp had too much low end previously, which is why the distortion was so ugly. Each section made some change and it all adds up, but reducing the low end seems to be the most important change. So after all that, if I was only doing one mod, I'd remove the master circuit and swap that 0.01 microfarad cap for the 0.001. You could even just try changing the capacitor. That's now converted the amp to Blackface specs. Here is the amp as it was at the start, with only the bias circuit change compared to now. A completely different sounding amp now, and I definitely like that a lot more. Much nicer sounding for my tastes, and I'm really glad I've done that modification. I am going to do a second video where I swap the coupling and tone control capacitors for Sozo versions of the blue Mallories used in the original Blackface amps, and also replace the cathode bypass caps. I know a lot of people don't believe the tone control or coupling capacitors make a difference in tone, assuming the values are the same. Having rebuilt my reissue Princeton reverb with Sozo caps where it definitely sounds 5 to 10% better than it did with the stock caps, I'm of the opinion they do sound different, even with the same values. Rereading the Silverface amp section in the Soul of Tone book, I was surprised to see a lot of talk about the cheaper caps Fender used in the Silverface models degrading the tone. So we'll find out. Any improvement is worth it in my books. So that's the end of part 1. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please hit that drop down menu and hit the bell notification so you get a notification when I make more of these. And I'll see you in part 2 when we test the capacitors.